Before the Space Marines, there was another army. Before the Primarchs, before the legions, before the eagle and the aquila, the emperor of mankind conquered the entire planet of Terra with an army of monsters he made himself, the Thunder Warriors. Bigger than men, faster than men, brutal beyond anything that had walked the earth, they broke every warlord and every techno-barbarian and every petty god-king of old Earth and handed the emperor his throne. And then they disappeared. The official histories barely mention them. The Space Marines who came after them are told almost nothing, because the Thunder Warriors were built to burn out, engineered with a flaw that would kill them young, so that when the conquest was done, the conquerors could be quietly, efficiently disposed of by the new army built to replace them. The emperor murdered his first sons the moment they had served their purpose. Now imagine you are one of the 20 Primarchs. You are loyal, you are brilliant, and you find the records. You learn what your father did to the army that came before you, and you understand, standing there, that you are simply the next version, and that the same fate is written for you. That isn't a heresy. That isn't a corruption. That is a truth so dangerous that the only way to contain it was to erase the son who found it. The destruction of the Thunder Warriors is established lore. The connection to the Lost Primarchs, the second, and the 11, is interpretation. You will know which is which, and the pattern will speak for itself. Terra, in the late M29, had been fracturing for millennia. The age of strife cut the planet off from its colonies, collapsed its institutions, and left it a cauldron of competing warlord states and techno-barbarian kingdoms across every continent. Warp storms held steady for thousands of years before they began to abate. The Emperor emerged openly for the first time as those storms quieted, leading forces that would campaign for several centuries. The opposition was genuine and varied in its brutality. The Pan-Pacific Empire, led by the tyrant Narthan Doom, was powerful enough that the Emperor had him executed rather than imprisoned, a departure from usual practice significant enough that historians note it as a signal of the specific threat Doom represented. The Indonesic bloc's leader, Cardinal Tang, continued resisting imperial rule until 703 M30, after most of Terra had already capitulated. Erst deployed enslaved psychers and warp-fueled weaponry in open battle. Its ruler, Caligan, was killed personally by the Emperor's forces when the kingdom finally fell. The Malin Sen Confederacy practiced cannibalistic human sacrifice and forbidden genetic experimentation, its priest-king eventually executed by the Emperor himself when the Confederacy fell. The Ethnarchy fielded genetically modified warrior caste soldiers and Dark Age of technology weapons. The first imperial attempt to break their strongholds cost 20,000 Thunder Warriors and 1 million other casualties before the attacking forces even reached the underground power generators. The Albions brought proto-dreadnought war engines to the field and held across multiple engagements before capitulating to diplomacy when the Emperor appeared before their clan lords, unarmed and clothed in white, offering them glory among the stars. The Thunder Warriors were the mechanism behind every one of those outcomes. Formerly designated the Legiones Catigis, the Thunder Legion, they were gene-enhanced soldiers created in secret laboratories before the Emperor ever stepped into public view, organized into 20 legions each limited to a few hundred warriors, because the engineering was labor-intensive and imprecise. Early genecraft pushed past its natural ceiling before the technology was truly ready. Lexicanum's canonical summary states it plainly. Wrought to be living weapons, the Thunder Warriors were known to be physically stronger, more savage, and more potent in combat than the later Astartes, though they weren't as long-lived. Their bones were denser than Space Marine bone, A deteriorating Thunder Warrior could shatter an Astartes skull with a headbutt. Their upper body strength was unparalleled. Their reflexes allowed a specimen already fighting two opponents to dodge a plasma gun shot simultaneously. Even a warrior whose augmentations were visibly failing, cellular degeneration advancing, mind beginning to fragment, remained capable of fighting multiple Space Marines at once. Unlike the custodians, individually crafted to near perfection, and unlike the later Astartes engineered for doctrinal stability and philosophical cohesion, the Thunder Warriors were assembled from the largest, most violent, most psychologically extreme techno-barbarians the Emperor could conscript. Their human emotions were never suppressed. They felt rage, contempt, dark humor, and the specific dread of watching their own bodies begin to fail. Their augmentations were killing them while still giving them strength. The brightness of the flame and the shortness of its life were the same design. Eric Tyrannus is the name the lore preserves as the clearest window into what these soldiers were. His titles compress the operational history: Victor of Gajware, the Last Rider, the Butcher of Scandia, the Throne Slayer, every one earned in a specific campaign against a specific enemy. At the massacre at Gajware in Franc, documented as one of the final formal engagements of the Unification Wars, 5,000 Thunder Warriors killed 50,000 rebel militia. That ratio is the operational reality of what they were, stated in numbers rather than description. The Saragorn enclave surrendered and then continued forbidden experiments in secret. When discovered, the Emperor dispatched the 8th Legion, and the enclave was obliterated to the last structure. Boeotia negotiated its independence for over 150 years before the Thousand Sons were finally assigned to end it. 600 years of war. Every warlord broken, every holdout ground down. Terra unified under one hand. In 669 M30, Imperial history says the Thunder Warriors died heroically at the Battle of Mount Ararat in the Kingdom of Urartu, the final declaration of Terra's unity, Eric Tyrannus raising the banner of lightning before falling with his brothers. An empire's founding myth. The old army, used and gone, replaced by the new. Eric Tyrannus survived to the outbreak of the Horus heresy, over 3 centuries after Ararat. His existence is the internal contradiction that breaks the official account. A man recorded as dead does not live for 3 more centuries under a false name in a city the empire now owns. The account was fabricated, and the fabrication's shelf life depended entirely on whether anyone looked closely enough. What followed Mount Ararat was a culling. The Custodian Guard carried out the primary extermination of the surviving Thunder Warriors. Ushotan, Primarch of the 4th Thunder Warrior Legion, the Iron Lords, a warrior whose tactical skill had earned the specific respect of Constantine Valdor himself, emerged from hiding during the palace coup that followed the Unification War's formal end, seeking revenge and a warrior's death alongside the surviving brothers he still commanded. He cut down several of the new 1st Legion Astartes before Valdor engaged him directly. The fight lasted far longer than the physical mismatch suggested it should. Ushotan was already deteriorating, his armor in poor repair, his plasma sword leaking when activated, and still he held. As he lay dying, he told Valdor he pitied him. Ushotan had lived short, but he had lived as a human, with human things to feel. Valdor, he said, had been stripped of everything but duty. Valdor agreed with the assessment before executing the dying warrior to end his suffering. Bands of Thunder Warriors continued to be hunted after the palace coup. Some had escaped off-world. The 1st Legion of the Legiones Astartes was assigned to track them down. A group surviving into the early Great Crusade, calling themselves the it.The, were among the renegades of the Cerberus insurrection. The 12th Legion, later the World Eaters, was dispatched to destroy them. Outnumbered and in physical decline, the it.The still killed 10 to 20 Space Marines for each Thunder Warrior before being ground under after hours of close-quarters combat. Even at the end, falling apart, they were something the legions couldn't put down easily. The genetic instability driving this physical collapse was severe and documented. Thunder Warriors who didn't die in battle suffered cellular degeneration, mental collapse, and sudden death. Tyrannus himself suspected the flaw was deliberate, built in from the start to ensure the emperor wouldn't need to justify killing them when their usefulness ended, only to let biology do the work. Lexicanum records this with a careful qualifier that reflects the lore's own ambiguity. The genetic flaw may have been deliberately written into their DNA during their creation to assure that when their usefulness was at an end, the problem would resolve itself. Whether that instability was a designed kill switch or an unavoidable cost of rushed gene craft pushed past its limits, the canon declines to close definitively. What it does not leave ambiguous is that the emperor made no effort to correct it, made no attempt to preserve the warriors who had handed him his throne, and ordered the survivors killed once the threshold of tolerance was crossed. The massacre was then concealed from the population of the Imperium for more than 10,000 years. Imperial propaganda preserved the narrative of heroic deaths at Ararat. The actual record, Ushotan dying under Valdor's blade, the it.The hunted across the early Great Crusade, the hunting parties systematically accounting for every survivor, was locked away, and the lock was actively maintained across every generation that followed. Not allowed to fade into natural obscurity. Systematically suppressed because the people doing the suppressing understood what would happen if it surfaced. The Thunder Warrior Purge was a method, and the method recurs across the full span of the setting. The Adeptus Custodes were kept structurally separate from the Space Marine Command hierarchy throughout the entire Great Crusade. They answered to the Emperor alone, not to a Primarch, not to a Legion commander, not to any figure in the Astartes chain. The custodians were, in the setting's own framing, handcrafted prototypes of the Emperor's vision of genetically enhanced super soldiers, while the Astartes were the mass production variant. Two parallel armed forces, one of which served as an implicit structural ceiling on the power of the other. The prototype doesn't answer to the product. After the Horus heresy, the surviving legions were fragmented. The second founding dispersed each legion into smaller chapters, explicitly so that no single commander would ever again hold the concentration of Space Marines that had made both the Great Crusade and its near destruction possible. The instrument that served its purpose was broken into manageable pieces the moment the emergency that justified it passed. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor across thousands of years, the most powerful psyker alive after the Emperor himself, sat down on the Golden Throne during the Siege of Terra, knowing it would kill him, buying the hours Rogel Dorn needed to find a replacement. The closest ally, expended for the mission when the mission required it. No canonical source records the Emperor grieving for the Thunder Warriors. No funerary rites. No acknowledgement of what the conquest of Terra had cost them. No mourning for 20 legions of soldiers who had fought for 6 centuries and broken a planet on his behalf. The setting does record the Emperor grieving. He is depicted as devastated by Horus's death at the Siege of Terra. The capacity for grief is present in the record. Its absence, specifically for the Thunder Warriors, is the meaningful data point. a distinction between a son he chose to recognize as a son and an instrument he decided had served its purpose. An army is built for a function. When the function is complete, the army's continued existence becomes a liability rather than an asset. The question has never been whether the emperor operates on this logic. Every major transition in the imperium's military architecture follows it. The question is only what happens when someone else reads the pattern and understands where it leads. In 821 m.30, the emperor found the Primarch of the Two Legion, the third Primarch to be discovered, found early enough to lead his legion for years through the Great Crusade. Fulgrim, in the novel Fulgrim, the Palatine Phoenix, names this brother as his quiet brother and the master of the second, a specific person with a specific character, registered by Fulgrim as someone present and real, not a stranger. In 927 m.30, over a century later, the 11th Primarch was found, the 19th of the 20 to be located. Both were gone before the Horus heresy began. The novel Betrayer references only 18 legions as active during heresy-era operations, the missing 2 not counted in the total. The erasure of both legions from imperial records occurred at least 43 standard years before the drop site massacre on Istvan V, during the Great Crusade itself, while the emperor still nominally led the project of human reunification. Whatever happened to them, it happened while the Imperium was being built, not while it was burning. Chris Wright's Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, the primary canonical source for Unification-era history, establishes comprehensive pre-Great Crusade imperial archives. The administrative machinery of the early Imperium ran on documentation, battles fought, forces deployed, populations conquered, enemies destroyed. The record of what the legiones Catagus accomplished, what was done to them when they were no longer needed, how the transition to the Astartes was managed, all of it existed somewhere in the vaults beneath the imperial palace, accessible to those with sufficient standing and access. A Primarch at the center of imperial power wasn't operating at the document access level of an ordinary general. Fulgrim knew his brother's character. Magnus discussed the Lost Primarchs with specific awareness of what had befallen them. Rogel Dorn and Robute Gilliman both held knowledge specific and severe enough that they went to Malcador and asked to have it removed from their own minds. The short story, The Chamber at the End of Memory, documents this directly. Malcador temporarily restores Dorn's suppressed memories so that Dorn can understand why his two brothers must remain lost and forgotten. The memories had existed first, then been removed, then were restored briefly for a specific purpose, then removed again. Malcador wasn't giving Dorn new information. He was returning something Dorn had once possessed and been made to unknow. The Horus heresy fiction also contains a scene in which Malcador confronts a Primarch who attempts to raise the subject of the Lost Brothers, loading his command to be silent with psychic force described as striking the Primarch's mind like a hammer to the forehead. Memory suppression at Primarch scale. Targeted, deployable, apparently used more than once. Dorn and Gilliman requested that suppression themselves. Whatever they had learned about the fate of the two lost legions was severe enough that two of the most disciplined, most institutionally grounded Primarchs in the cohort chose to have the knowledge extracted, not imposed on them by the Emperor, chosen by them, because carrying it was incompatible with the work they were still being asked to do. Picture a loyal Primarch, the quiet brother, known to Fulgrim by character, leading his legion across dozens of expeditions. walking through the right archive on Terra and finding the record of what the Thunder Warriors' post-unification existence actually looked like. The battles at Godware and Malin Sen, the palace coup, Ushoten dying under Valdor's blade, the Dight Tar, centuries after Ararat, still running, Tyrannus still breathing under a false name, the carefully maintained propaganda of heroic last stands, and then, deeper in the record, the operational orders that contradict it. A being engineered for loyalty to the emperor, trained to process strategic situations at inhuman speed, working through the evidence that the army before him was built with a finite lifespan and ended on a schedule. The realization arriving not as a shock but as a pattern completion. The same logic that built the Thunder Warriors built the legions, and the same logic that ended the Thunder Warriors has no principled mechanism for stopping short of them. The prologue of Fear to Tread shows what the fear looks like from outside. Sanguinius kills a blood angel named Alatros, who has succumbed to the red thirst, his legion's genetic flaw concealed from the emperor. Horus asks why he never sought help from his father. Sanguinius answers without ambiguity. He won't be responsible for the erasure of the blood angels from imperial history. He won't have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as his legion's only memorial. Third, Sanguinius counted 2 plinths already empty and was afraid of a third. His fear was specifically of the mechanism that emptied the first 2, a judgment that a flaw or transgression made continued existence indefensible, followed by deletion rather than condemnation. He had no specific knowledge of what those 2 brothers had done. He understood categorically what had been done to them, and he was afraid of it for reasons that had nothing to do with chaos and everything to do with the logic by which armies are audited and retired. Whatever a Primarch found in those archives, that fear is the most direct surviving window into what finding it would do to a being built for loyalty. 2 branches, neither provable. Both must be followed because the evidence doesn't close either one. The first, a deal was struck. The 2 Primarch, the quiet brother, registering as a specific person with specific character even in Fulgrim's brief mention, leading his legion for years before his disappearance, found the truth and negotiated an exit. He wouldn't expose what he knew. He wouldn't bring it to his brothers or his legion or anyone who would understand what it meant. In exchange, he and a portion of his legion left, into space beyond the Crusade's reach, records sealed, memories suppressed by Malcador, whose capability at that scale was demonstrated in documented operations against Rogel Dorn himself. A legion departing intact into the uncharted dark, its existence subsequently erased from every record it had appeared in, would leave exactly the kind of absence the surviving lists show. 2 numbers, no names, gaps in an enumeration that acknowledge a deletion without explaining what was deleted. Fulgrim's quiet brother reads less like the hole left by a monster than like the memory of someone who was known and then simply gone. The psychic suppression Malcador deployed against Primarchs who raised the subject would have been available to enforce whatever silence was required. A deal has a mechanism.
The mechanism existed and was used in other documented circumstances. The second, a forced removal. In Prospero Burns, Leman Russ's function as the Emperor's executioner is stated as explicit purpose, his weird, the role he was created to serve. Later in the same novel, he notes that this isn't the first time the Space Wolves have been called to fight their own. Both lost legions were already gone before the burning of Prospero. The comment isn't a reference to his engagements with the Dark Angels or the World Eaters. He carries the weight of someone who performed an act they haven't made peace with, not the clean resolution of duty discharged and finished.
Ushoten died when Valdor decided he needed to die. The Custodian Guard executed a named Thunder Warrior Primarch equivalent in direct combat, and the record confirms it. The structural capability to remove a Space Marine Primarch existed. A Primarch who found the Thunder Warrior records and couldn't be made silent. One who intended to bring the truth to his brothers, to his legion, to anyone who would understand what it implied, was a specific category of problem. A truth-teller is more dangerous than a traitor, because a traitor's damnation can be preserved as propaganda and pointed at for 10,000 years. A truth-teller has to be erased. Aaron Dembski Bowden's The First Heretic supplies the epithet those inside the fiction applied to both, the forgotten and the purged. Two different words. Two Primarchs who may have stood in entirely different relationships to what they knew and what they chose to do with it. One forgotten in the sense of being permitted to recede, one purged in the sense that purging was required. The forensic argument rests on a tonal distinction the lore preserves across dozens of canonical sources, and that distinction is the evidence. When a Primarch falls to chaos, the Imperial record preserves him permanently. Horus Lupercal is the arch-traitor, his name a byword for betrayal across 10 millennia. Lorgar, Angron, Mortarion, Fulgrim, Magnus, Perturabo, Conrad Kurz, Alfarius, all named, all documented, all preserved in various states of condemnation and infamy. Their legions carry the designation excommunicate traitoris in imperial listings. They are remembered, specifically and permanently, because the infamy of the traitors is load-bearing for imperial ideology. Their damnation justifies every inquisitorial purge that follows. A condemned enemy is a useful enemy. His example teaches obedience across every generation that inherits the lesson. The 2nd and 11 legions received a categorically different mechanism. In imperial listings of the 20 legions, their entries are noted as having been expunged or destroyed. The meta-record survives. Surviving documents specifically state that entries were deleted. The formal mechanism is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory in High Gothic. But where the traitor legions remain infamous in imperial records, listed as excommunicate traitoris, permanently accessible as examples of betrayal, the 2nd and 11 are reduced to anonymous gaps in the enumeration. 2 numbers, no names, no Primarchs, no homeworlds, no charges. Just placeholders in a list, acknowledging an absence without explaining what occupied it. In Horus Heresy Book 1, Betrayal, the redactions applied to the 2nd and 11 aren't uniform filler. By character count, the 2nd Legion's name was long, close to the length of Emperor's Children. The 11 Legion's name measured approximately as long as Thousand Sons. The 2nd Primarch's name was a single word roughly the length of Alfarius. The 11 Primarch's name, by length, suggests either 2 names or 1 name with a title. These were specific, targeted deletions of specific, known information. The same volume notes that of the 20 Primarchs, save 2 whose secrets are far beyond this record, each was eventually placed in command of a legion. Every one of the 9 known traitors is discussed extensively elsewhere in the same book. Whatever distinguished the Lost Primarchs was considered by the authors of that record to be categorically more sensitive than the documented heresies of Lorgar or Magnus. In The First Heretic, Magnus and Lorgar discuss the Lost Primarchs, aware of the taboo, speaking with regret and unease, and neither uses the vocabulary of chaos, corruption, heresy, or damnation. The novel also supplies the epithet those who survived them used, the forgotten and the purged. Horace alludes to the Lost Brothers exactly once across the entire Horus Heresy series, obliquely, with no names given. Even the arch-traitor, who had every tactical incentive to use the Emperor's treatment of the Lost Legions as evidence of the Emperor's true character, treats the subject as untouchable. The taboo crosses faction lines. The oath of silence following the erasure is documented. The remaining Primarchs swore not to speak of the Lost Brothers or their legions. In 1,000 Suns, Magnus begins referencing an occasion when all of the Primarchs had gathered together. Mortarion cuts him off immediately. He knows well when it was, and the Emperor forbade them to speak of it again. The prohibition is reflexive, total, and enforced by direct imperial command. Magnus had started a sentence about a time when 20 Primarchs stood together, before 2 of them were erased from the count. Mortarion doesn't let him finish. Oaths of silence are imposed on truths, not on traitors. You condemn a traitor permanently. You weaponize his failure as a lesson. An oath not to speak of someone is imposed on information that remains dangerous even in its absence, not on villainy that has already been publicly denounced and catalogued. Robute Guilliman, in the 2021 revised edition of Dark Imperium by Guy Haley, counts his brothers. 17 are present, 2 are absent. He separates the absent 2 from the 9 traitors explicitly, a different category, a different kind of loss. The word he uses is failed, not betrayed, not heretic, not damned, failed. Wargamer's summary of that passage describes his register as sober and regretful, suggesting something more complex or insidious than simple armed rebellion. He doesn't know precisely what happened. The memories were removed. The shape of his uncertainty is the shape of a man who had those memories removed for a reason he understood at the time, not the shape of a man who simply forgot which brothers chose chaos. In Deliverance Lost, Corax is reunited with the Emperor and realizes only 17 other Primarchs are being claimed. He himself is the 19th, which means the arithmetic should produce 18. He asks how this is possible. The Emperor's face becomes, in Corax's account, bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He tells Corax it's a conversation for another day. Sorrow, specifically. The setting has other available emotional registers for this moment: anger, disgust, righteous certainty, and the one recorded is grief. The complicated grief of a man who made a decision that required loss and carries the weight of it without being relieved of it. Sanguinius standing over the blood angel he just executed, afraid of a third empty plinth. The Emperor's face going bleak when Corax asks the wrong question. Guilliman reaching for a word that isn't traitor and landing on failed. Russ saying it wasn't the first time. Dorn choosing to unknow. These 5 emotional registers, across 5 different canonical sources, across multiple authors and multiple decades of publication, none of them are the emotional architecture of people managing the aftermath of chaos corruption. They are the emotional architecture of people who know something about a father they continue to serve, something that implicates them, something they can't look at directly without fracturing the loyalty the entire project requires. You condemn a traitor. You erase a truth. The Imperium deployed both mechanisms, and it deployed them for different ends. The Imperium will tell you the Lost Primarchs failed, but you don't erase a failure, you make an example of it. You erase a truth. And the truth 2 of the Emperor's sons may have died to bury is the one written in the bones of the army that came before them. that the master of mankind builds his children for a purpose and ends them when the purpose is served. The Thunder Warriors learned it first, and the Emperor killed them for being obsolete. The Lost Primarchs learned it second, and the Emperor erased them for knowing. And the Space Marines, the Third Army, the ones still kneeling, still praying, still dying in his name, have never been told at all. That's not an accident. That's the secret. Somewhere in the Imperial Palace on Terra, 2 plinths stand empty among the 20 statues of the Primarchs. By the time of the Horus heresy, they had been vacant for a long time, and no one ever spoke of the 2 absent brothers or their separate tragedies. Separate tragedies. 2 different stories, 2 different endings arrived at the same silence. Belisarius Cawl spent 10,000 years developing the Primaris Marines under Guilliman's authority. A new generation, physically superior to the pattern they were introduced to supplement, arriving in an imperium that had spent 10 millennia defended by the previous pattern. During the Indomitus Crusade, a Chaos Space Marine explicitly frames the structural implication to a Primaris warrior. How long until the new army executes its true orders and cuts the archaic and the obsolete away like chaff? The taunt comes from an enemy of the Imperium. The structure it describes is one the Imperium has already executed twice before. First Army, Second Sons, Third Army, each superseding the last, each generation loyal, each generation never told what became of the generation before. The Emperor is 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. The secret holds. The Space Marines still kneel. Subscribe for more stories from the architecture the official record was built to hide.